much of one. But and I'm a genius like Joe Biden, is it? Okay. Now, well, listen, I want to have prayer to start class. We're going to be together for 3 hours, and we're going to cover largely Old Testament. Dr. Gramacki had said maybe I just want to go to New Testament because that's really more my area. I'm working on a textbook on New Testament. I did half of the book with Randall Price, although by the time he found all the books of the Old Testament that he hadn't dealt with, I kept surrendering. I kept surrendering article by article by article to the point I said, Randy, I'm going to be just a footnote. And so I ended up with just a little under 30%, and then Stan Gunder refused to make it a dual authorship since I had done less than him. But that's crazy, but nonetheless, that's what happened. The original book actually had us both together, so I really hate that. But anyway, I'm doing my own book in archaeology, and Randy and I are going to be doing a book. Anybody ever see my charts books? I've written 8 of them so far, and I really like that. It's really a lot of fun. Well, I'm producing. I have 2 of the charts books finished, and I'm working on another one, which is going to be on biblical archaeology, which is going to be real unique. And Randy and I are going to do that together. So we had agreed to that years ago, so we're going to go ahead and go through with it. But you'll enjoy that when we come out with it. Let's have prayer, and I want to take you on to something else before we start the archaeology stuff, okay? Let's pray. Lord, we just give you thanks for all the blessings that we receive, and we know they're all coming from you, who is the Father of lights and the one who cares for us and takes care of us. And Father, we just appreciate you working in each of our lives and giving us your guidance and helping us in this course and furthering our understanding. And Lord, we just pray that we be not worthy because we're not, but that we be faithful to what you have done and glorify Christ in our actions. And bless us tonight in what we do. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. As I was praying, I was thinking of something in the Old Testament actually hit my head. Do you know how you can talk and you are also thinking about something totally different at the same time? That's weird how the mind works. Sometimes when I'm speaking to a group and I'm actually thinking of other things as I'm talking, I don't know how to do it. But anyway, it dawned on me about when I said about the fact that we're not worthy and he's providing all of our blessings. And that's just the opposite of the ancient Near East, where gods created humans to take care of them and feed them. and we find just the opposite in the Bible, that God takes care of us, not that we take care of God, because it says that he has no need of anything. Romans chapter 11 says, he doesn't need anything from any of us. So what a difference in the way of looking at deity. And the biblical text just really shows us that the whole concept of God that we worship is different from the ancient Near East. People try to say that Moses just kept borrowing and borrowing and borrowing stuff from the ancient world. And if so, he didn't borrow very well. You understand my point? That's just a little insight that just hit me all of a sudden as I was praying. I thought, we need God, but he doesn't need us a bit. He'll survive quite well if we're not around. But fortunately for us who are unworthy, he's going to provide everything. Isn't that wonderful? I'm sorry, I just got this thing in my head. Wow. Anyway, and it relates to archaeology and ancient Near East. So anyway, I want to share something with you, and you don't have to do it. I'm not putting anybody under obligations, but I hope that you're using my Visual Study Bible. Are you? I don't know if anybody is, but this has never, ever been done since the world began. I had a guy who works on Bible programs on the internet, and he knows that he's been working on it for decades. And he told me, I didn't ask him to, he just did it. He said, I've checked the top 100 Bible programs on the internet, And he says, there's not a single one that's even close to what you've done. You're unique. And I got this idea from the Lord, I believe, when I was sitting in Caesarea Philippi one day. I teach usually there, then I take a few moments to reflect and pray, and I have the groups to go off and do what they do. And it hit me. I did a book that way called The Jesus Who Never Lived. That came out of Caesarea Philippi in my talk. But I was thinking, you know, I wish I could take more people to Israel. I mean, I've been there 46 times now, and I've taken a lot of people, but I thought, what if I could take it to them? And I came up with a way, and I got a phenomenal programmer, and this is what, you don't have to go hunt for things, and you don't have to pay thousands of dollars for books. All you have to do is push the biblical text and it comes to you. Shows you, you click it, it goes away. And it's just all the way through. And I'm working very, very hard on that. I'm almost finished with the New Testament. I wrote down the other day which chapters I haven't dealt with, and I just have about 20 to go. So, and then I'll be done with the thing, and then we'll be out. And then I'm actually already done a bunch in the Old Testament. But I want to show you something I did for Easter. Easter's coming up, right? We will arrive in Israel just after the Passover and Ramadan. Fortunately, they'll be off the Temple Mount by the time we get there for looking on the Temple Mount. But, you know, Ramadan, they take it all over, the Muslims do. But I want to show you something that I came up with. Now, watch this. This is, if you look to the left, let's see, can you see the left of my screen? Do you see that where I have all these days and so forth? Is that there? Right? Okay, I want to be sure you're looking at it. Notice I have Sunday, day 1. Now, I'm going to change the days on this because it's not going to be this date. So I'm still working on this. I'm not quite ready. I did this last year. But for example, Sunday, day 1 of Passion Week. If you click that, that's day 1 of Passion Week. Does that make sense? And then, so what you can do on Passion Week, and if you had other people use a study Bible, this is what I'm doing. By the way, I'm planning on this kind of stuff with everything, you know, to make it easier. Because I want you to, you see the right-hand side, what do you have? The biblical text. That's what I want people to read, the biblical text. I don't have to spend 15 minutes trying to find the meaning of a word somewhere, and they leave the biblical text and forgot where they were. I keep it in front of you all the time. That's the Bible. On the right, I give you the information, and it's just a click. Open, click, close. It's that simple. Now, what's this? Now, this is Matthew 21. I got to there just by looking at the search engine. This is the first day of Passion Week. So what you do is you read this. This is what happened on day 1 in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is what happened in the Gospels, day 1. You have a picture. You have a link. You can use all these things, and if you ever take a link and go away, all you have to do is come up to the return at the top. Can you see that? Click, and it doesn't take you back. Passion Week. Okay, I thought that did that. It didn't. Let me go back again and put Passion again. I guess it takes you. I thought I had that solved. I may have to work on that. Passion Week, day 1. Here's where we were again. I'll try it this. I hope this works. Jesus walks from Bethany to the village of Bethphage. Now, if you want to study this, it's there. You can get back to the same place. Hopefully, this is going to come up and look big. And there you have a picture of the area of the temple. This is the pinnacle. These are areas around it and so forth. This is a good picture. You can click that. And oh, there you are. Just click that and you get back. Now that shows you that. Then you ride a donkey. You can read this. You can read all these things. Now let's say you're at day 2 now. You can either go to the search engine and start day 2, or you can go next. And now you're at day 2 of the Passion Week. You can read all the passages that deal with day 2, the events that occur. When day 3 comes, you just simply click that, and now you're at day 3. Does it make sense to you? That way you can use this day by day during the Passion Week to read the passages and to see the events and stay on target for what you're trying to do. You can obviously come down here and click this. You can see a picture of the Temple Mount as it is today, southern steps. How many have been to Israel? Let me raise your hand. I have 2 slots. Remember that, 2 slots left that I have to fill up, or I'm going to have to pay for them. So 2 slots, and I'll be glad to have you join if you want to. Anyway, this is a southern wall. Here are all the baptismal pools. People used to argue, how would they ever be able to find water to baptize 3,000 people on that day? How could they do that? If you have 12 disciples and you have 31 baptismal pools, you can do it. And that's exactly what took place. They went from here at Solomon's portico, because this wasn't there. Remember, this wasn't. And you had Solomon's portico that went down this way. That's where Peter was preaching, most likely. And then they took him down and baptized him right there. Isn't that cute? Okay. Now you can close that, go back to here, and again, then you can go to day 4. Notice what happens on day 4. It was a day of rest, apparently, because the Gospels don't really give us anything going on. But then you can go on to day 5, and you can see the events on this day and read it through, read the passages, and then you can go to day 6 and so forth and so on. Okay? That could be a nice thing to use to keep up with the Passion Week each year. And you can share that with friends and go through the Passion stories. I just thought it might be something interesting to be able to use and study the Bible with. Now, you know how the study Bible works, I think. You go here. See how I'm not pushing that. I'm moving the cursor on top of it. You know how to do that? Just put the cursor on top. And every place that there is something written, it comes up right here. But you can just simply go here if you want to, because it has the verses on the right of where they are. So let's say you want us to look at this right here. After 2 days of Passover is coming. And then you see, what over here do I have that's talked about this? Well, I have an article on the ossuaries of Annas and Caiaphas. That relates to the guys that were involved in the Passion Week with Jesus, right? Here's a biography of Caiaphas, the high priest. Remember, he's the one that said it's important that one man die for the nation, the whole nation not perish. Remember that? Okay. Then you can also go over here and you have the Caiaphas from the front over against the sides. Here's the prison of Caiaphas at Gallicantu. Here's an ossuary of the high priest again, and here is the steps. That's just referring to that one thing, not everything. Then you keep on going down here. As you come across things that I've covered, then it lights up. Now here, what is that? I don't know. I'll click it. It's a statement about that day 4. You go back. And so you have all these things to work through. Zebedee of Jericho, which is fascinating. Gethsemane, the garden. All these events that occur, you can click through here and just go through. I have it, everything the text talks about here, I'm trying to have some understanding of it from over here. Anyway, that's the thing I'm working on. Modestly called the House Visual Study Bible, like Ryrie Study Bible, Schofield Study Bible, But I call it the HVSB. And I actually, you ever seen the Bible called it's called now the New King James Study Bible, but it used to be called the Nelson Study Bible. Have you seen that before? Earl Rodmacher, Ron Allen, and I worked on that for 8 years to get it done. And we had 30 authors that helped, who wrote articles in every book, And then we had an entire team at Nelson Publishers, and it took 8 years to get it out. I'm doing this largely by myself. And yet I've got about every one of my chapters here probably is worth 10 pages in the Nelson Study Bible as far as data. So it's a lot of work, but I'm gradually moving through it. And I really believe the Lord wanted me to do it, so I'm doing it. And I think it gets a benefit. So you can tell your friends, relatives, and everybody else you can think of, okay? All right. Well, that's enough about my stuff. I just wanted you to have that experience that there's some things here that might be of some value to you. Okay? So let's get off of this, and we're going to go on to the issue of archaeology. Dr. Gramacki did not have this, but I think this is important for us to look at. There's the archaeology of the Old Testament goes everywhere from looking at, what do we know about creation archaeologically? Well, not a lot to work with there. There are a few little things in the ancient world, for example, which looks like, for example, a serpent maybe trying to convince Adam and Eve. And I've seen that somewhere, and I don't even remember where it is anymore, but I saw that at some museum. And but there are a few things like that. Then you have obviously the creation accounts and the Syro-Babylonian materials. You have the flood accounts and so forth and so on. Now, I want to talk about geography because this is probably more of something we need to understand as we do archaeological materials. Importance of a text in a context. That's true with hermeneutics on the individual meaning of a text. That's also true about understanding what's going on in the ancient world. You need a context for it. And you find a lot. I'm teaching a course at another university to not be named right now that I'm dealing with students in PhD program, just like you guys, although you guys are far more fun. This other thing, I feel like just a correspondence teacher. They send me a note, I write a note back, they send me a note, it's that kind of stuff. You guys, I have a chance to see you and see you smile or whatever's going on, and I much prefer this. It's not quite the classroom, but it'd be hard for me to fly up there every week anyway. So, but I think it's important that we have an understanding about events within specific locations. Helps us understand. For example, this is a New Testament one, but if anybody, a lot of you haven't been to Israel, but if you were at the Tel Megiddo site, ancient Megiddo, you have in front of you what is called the Valley of, at one time, Jehoshaphat, another called the Valley of Jezreel, and because of what happened at Megiddo, when the Latin and the Greek both dropped the H, mountain in Hebrew is all you know because you're Hebrew scholars now, is har means mountain. But there is no H for the Latin and Greek. I know we have that little rough breathing mark for Greek, but that's not as a true letter. Now, it comes over as Megiddo, Armageddon. That's how we get to it, and that really comes more from the Latin. So you have Tel Megiddo, you have the Valley of Jezreel, and then right on there you have a place called Tabor, Mount Tabor. And a lot of people view that, well, that's the place of the transfiguration of Jesus. And they have a monastery up there and a church and some nice stuff. And I don't begrudge them any of that. I mean, they're trying their best, and that's their viewpoint, and I'm not going to argue against it particularly. But that's not the place. Because the text, for two reasons. The text says that he took them up to a high mountain. Very, very important term. Now, if anybody who lives in Texas knows what that is at Tabor, it's called a bump. It's just a little bitty mountain. It's really a hill. It's not really a mountain. But if you're in the desert, that'd probably be a mountain. But if you are from a country that has mountains that are 20,000 feet in the air, it's not a mountain at all. So it depends on a contextual thing. It's a problem we have with translation. The people who did the KJV made a big mistake. They did not go to the Holy Land to gain historical and cultural understanding before they translated. And may I suggest to you there are translators in modern translations that do the same thing. If you want to read a discussion of this, you can go to my Visual Study Bible and read a detailed explanation on the issue of John chapter 15, which has been mistranslated repeatedly, and nobody seems to get it right because they don't know anything about the culture. They don't know anything about the language. They're just repeating what somebody said, who somebody else said, and goes on back. They're not really going to the Greek to get it. And I show you in that passage because every single Greek lexicon, from the classical Greek lexicons to the patristic Greek lexicons to the Greco-Roman Greek lexicons to the New Testament lexicons, and I could go on, I've got them all. And every one of them has a word translated the same way the first thing is in every lexicon on this passage that deals with the word. And yet they just keep on repeating themselves. Same thing happens in a lot of stuff this way. They just keep repeating themselves. You think anybody from the King James, if they had actually come to Israel and visited what the Hebrews call Lake Kinneret, which we find the word Galilee in the New Testament in the English, anybody who thinks that's a sea doesn't know what a sea is. It's a big Texas lake. Matter of fact, it's probably a medium-sized Texas lake, but it's certainly not a sea. Well, why did that come about? Because the word yam can take on the meaning of a sea or lake according to what you're talking about. But all the Jews call it a lake, and they do so rightfully. Okay? Translation becomes important because you need not only the meaning of words, and that doesn't always solve the problems, as I just indicated, but also understanding culture and also understanding geography and landscapes. That's a question of context also. Does that all make sense to you? I hope I'm just not beating a drum. I think people fail at this point. Okay? Now, I'll give you another example. Jesus at the wedding at the Cana, where they were drinking Welch's grape juice. And Jesus came and made a Welch's grape juice that tastes like none other. By the way, the word grape juice, although it exists in the ancient world in Greek, is never found in the New Testament. Never. I wrote an entire article for the Baker's Encyclopedia of the Bible. I've checked out every instance of that word, oinos, in Greek, in Latin, and other groupings. I also read 2 books on viticulture. I wanted to know what it said, and I wrote an article. Now, you know why I did all those things? Because I wanted to understand the text. Contextually, grammatically, syntactically, lexicographically, culturally, geographically, whatever I need, you need to get the context. I'm trying to force the idea upon you to read, because this is the failure of biblical interpretation. When you do slight study and come to a conclusion. I argued with the head of the Bible Translation Committee for the NIV and the ESV 3 or 4 years one time on a translation in Galatians 1. And finally, he came to me last year or two. He said, we changed it. It's about time you changed it. You were wrong. And so you have to watch those things. Geography is another thing that has to do with it. People can make mistakes because they don't understand geography in reference to what's going on. The high mountain, Tabor doesn't fit. But what about Arbel? Have you seen Mount Arbel? I can show you pictures on the study Bible. But if you look at Arbel, it's really a mountain. It's not a hill like Tabor, not Megiddo, or what these others are. It's a real mountain. But it's not it's not a really, really, really high mountain, but it is higher than anything else in the Galilee. But why wouldn't I take that? Why wouldn't I take that and then consider that Mount Tabor is the place of the transfiguration? That's a question. I give you an example of Tabor. I've said it's a hill. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit topographically what it is. It doesn't make any sense. But I've already said Arbel, though, is very high in comparison. It's higher than Megiddo. Than Masada probably. So why don't they take that as a transfiguration? It's right outside of Capernaum. That's where Jesus lived. So why would I say that doesn't fit either for what the writer is talking about Jesus and the Transfiguration. We're going to have a long moment of silence if you guys don't think on this. Topography and geography are all important to understand the text.
Can you restate the question?
The question is this. I showed you with Tabor that the topography, it's too small to be what we would call a high mountain because all of them are the same there, and they're bumps. They're really just really small hills. So the text says it's a high mountain, so it's something other than Tabor, even though they have a monastery there, okay, that speaks of the Transfiguration. Why wouldn't I say Arbel in view of the fact that Jesus lived in Capernaum right down from the Sea of Galilee from it? That seems like that would be maybe, why don't we consider that Mount Arbel to be the high mountain that's mentioned by the gospel writer? What are the things I got to work with? In biblical interpretation, word meaning, syntax, grammar, topography, geography, culture, you know, we've got all these factors that come into context of understanding. If you don't do this, I don't want you to write a commentary for me.
So I guess we'd start with the text and see what the text says exactly.
Well, what the text
says doesn't
exactly.
name any one of them.
It says that he took them into a high mountain, and then it goes on to discuss a transfiguration. That's what we've got to work with. But there's something else in that text that I'm not telling you about, or I'd be answering my own question.
It did say there were no other people there, so I guess you have to have a mountain that's somewhat remote.
Who did you have?
Well, Peter,
James, and John.
Peter, James, and John. They're the trio that was with Jesus more than the whole group. Okay. Well, that's an important consideration, but that's the fact of how many people. That doesn't really help me to understand why the mountain Arbel doesn't fit. I'm telling you, as a matter of fact, it doesn't fit. But my question is why?
Was this part of the narrative where?
Oh, it's in Matthew 17 you can go to.
But another thing the text says is, and I don't know if this is what you're referring to, but it says as they were coming down.
Who's talking?
This is Andre.
Oh, Andre, you are. Your picture's not there. Okay, they were coming down, so it's obviously something you have to go down, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Does Peter, when Peter refers to it in his epistle and says that they were there with him on the sacred mountain, is he calling it, using that adjective simply because that's how he thinks of it now, past after it's happened, or was it a sacred mountain before?
Okay, that is a consideration. I really hadn't even thought of that myself because we're not really in the Matthew passage, but you're in Peter when he looks back at it and he called it a sacred mountain. But the issue would be, did the people consider this mountain that we're talking about as a sacred mountain? In other words, in their viewpoints, culturally there or religiously, or is it sacred because something that occurred at the mountain? Right. Like Mount Sinai, wherever that was, became holy because of what?
The tablets.
Yahweh had met at that place, yeah. Right? That's why it became holy ground. Before God appeared in a burning bush, that wasn't sacred. And then it became sacred. So maybe that's what Peter's saying. But that's a good thought. That could have been something. It's so simple that you're thinking you're moving right past it. Arbel's right next to the Sea of Galilee, which is right there by Capernaum where Jesus lived, as did Peter and Andrew and so forth, right? You know that. But Arbel is not the place, but I want to know why it's not the high mountain. And there's something that's not being talked about. But that was Christopher, that was a good shot. That really was. I didn't think of it. There's something else very obvious.
In the earlier context of the passage, it says that they were in the vicinity of Caesarea Philippi.
We're getting there. David, you've got us almost to the finish line.
Okay.
Geographically, they weren't at Capernaum in what we call the Galilee, but they were geographically at a place called Panias. Panias, P-A-N-I-S, after the god Pan, a worship site, a pagan site, where they had the temple of Augustus Caesar. They had possibly the entrance to Hades there at that location in the back. And it was a place that Jesus and the disciples had been. And you know where that's located? It's located in the Golan Heights area, way above Capernaum and Arbel. Now, we got us up in the north, at the very far north. Syria is just a few miles away. By that, we mean you can go a little higher and you can walk across the street into Syria. So here's the issue. What's up there that's important for us to understand as far as a high mountain?
And they're like a big
Mount
volcano.
Hermon.
Mount Hermon.
Mount Hermon.
Hermon.
That's the only other thing you got to work with. You've got Hermon as a mountain, Arbel as a mountain, Tabor as a hill. So when we read the passage and you know the geographics of the passage, that opens up understanding of the location. Does that make sense? And David, that you hit it right on the nail. That's the issue. They were there at Caesarea Philippi. You know, whom do men say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And the whole thing. Now, isn't that appropriate? If you think about that passage, then if I were preaching this, I'd do it this way. But, you know, you're reading this passage and I wrote my book called The Jesus Who Never Lived. How many have read that? You're all failures for the course. I'm going to pass that along. That's maybe the best book that I've ever written. To me, it's an extremely important book because I thought about when I was there, I thought, why would you ask this question, whom do men say that I am? And what do the disciples come back with? That you are the people. You are John the Baptist,
Elias.
Right. Elijah or
Jeremiah, or
One of the prophets.
That's who the people are saying Jesus is. Now let's think on that just a moment. Why would John the Baptist not make any sense?
He's been beheaded.
He lost his head to Herod Antipas. Why would not Elias make any sense?
He was raptured in a fiery chariot.
Raptured in a fiery chariot. I guess it's my hand signals that's helping here. He says, what about Jeremiah?
He's dead.
He's dead. And what about one of the prophets?
They're dead.
Why would the people be thinking that Jesus is one of these characters that we're looking at in the Bible? Well, the Jews at that time believed in
a forerunner?
Resurrection. Yeah, there was a belief in a resurrection. So when they got to the fact of whom do men say that I am, they picked someone that would be a mighty person. Elijah would be a magnificent. John the Baptist had already proved himself. Jeremiah the prophet, there's a lot of things about him that we could say, why is Jesus like him? But I don't want to go into all of that right now. But then Jesus said, but who do you say that I am? Now, look, the people would have a different understanding of Jesus than the disciples would. Why?
Because they were with him and they were his inner circle.
Sure, they were with him all the time. And additionally, he had chosen to reveal himself to them in a manner in which he did not to the people in general. Jesus didn't go to the people on the mountainside and say, I'd just like you to know I'm Messiah. Even at the baptism, it's God the Father who says, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. It's John the Baptist who recognizes the fact of his messiahship. Jesus didn't go broadcasting. Matter of fact, he said sometimes to the disciples, don't tell them. Did you get that? You got to get all this stuff in perspective. And so you have Jesus here at Caesarea Philippi, in which he is asking some very important questions. He says, you've been with me a while. What have you learned from being in relationship with me? And Peter, in one of his better moments, because not all of them are good, in his better moments, he says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus said to him, flesh and blood has not revealed it to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Right? We got that whole scenario there. That is so important. Now, does that make sense? I've taken the time to do this in order to help you to think about how to go through this materials as you're trying to put together a talk or an understanding of the text. Because how do I say you need to understand that? A lot of people just look up words, or they just look up grammar, or they just look up something. You got to put things together. One is geography, one is topography, one is culture. See, not to mention even just the literary context itself. And one is geography. So he says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now, it's Peter who did that. I want you to think when they were up in the vicinity of Mount Hermon, how would going to Mount Hermon and the Transfiguration have anything whatsoever to do with the fact that we have Jesus revealed to the disciples as being Messiah, the Son of God?
We did mention that they believe that there was a portal to hell there, right?
There was a view of the superstition. And by the way, you have another example of this at a place called Hierapolis in Turkey, where they believe that you had the entrance into Hades. There were 2 or 3 places in the ancient world. This is one, behind the temple of Augustus Caesar. And that's why Jesus said, probably, and the gates of Hades, not the burning fire, the gates of Hades, the place of the dead, will not be able to conquer you, right? You can't put out the church, so to speak. Even Hades can't fight the church. You know why it won't fight us? Ooh. I think there's an anticipation of the future resurrection of the people of God. I think that's part of it. But we may come up with other terms too. I don't know. But so you have it here, gates of Hades. Why does that event and the next event that occurs is going up into the mountain with Peter, James, and John, who seem to be the trio that leads the group? Why does the events that occur on the Mount of Transfiguration relate to what occurred in Caesarea Philippi? Let me give you an example. Why did the identification of Jesus as the baptized Son of God, Messiah, with John's baptism, why was it followed directly by Jesus being led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted? Do you ever notice the relationship of these things? He went to be tempted because of what occurred with John in baptism. Now, here's my question on another thing. You got to sort of see this stuff, the movements. How is it that the being declared to be the Messiah, Son of God, relate to the fact that he's on the Mount of Transfiguration with the Father saying, behold my Son, hear him. Remember, Peter said, oh, we'll create a tabernacle for Elijah, we'll create one for Moses, who appeared. And there's a reason why they appeared, the law and the prophets, you know. They appeared there because remember, later on in Luke, Jesus started teaching them what? From the law, the prophets, and the writings, those things that concerned himself, right? So in the Mount of Transfiguration, you have the law, and you have the prophets, and the 3 men and Jesus and the Father's voice. Those things occurred there, but they relate, I would argue, to what occurred at Caesarea Philippi? Put that together for me. Be a good test question on an essay test.
Well, you have the Caesarea Philippi, this is Eduardo speaking. You have Pan's temple there. I was actually there with you in 2014. I saw it. We went up there. And so when Jesus is talking about who he is as the Messiah and the gates of Hades, he's demonstrating that where Satan's territory is, the church is going to take that over. And then the next scene, if you will, substantiates that with them going up to the high mountain and then the cloud, this is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased. It's substantiating the claim that Jesus is the Messiah. That's why the two are related.
Yeah, you're getting there. You're getting there. That's essentially what it is. We'll say a little bit more, but you have a declaration, an admission by him to the disciples that I am in fact who you say I am. The substantiation then by the Father on the high mountain with Peter, James, and John, Moses, and Elijah. That's important too. Both the Old Testament declares him to be Messiah, the proclamation of himself as Messiah, and the Father's voice that he's Messiah all go together into one little matrix of a sort that needed to be necessary to solidify the claim. Does that make sense? Hear him, he says, forget about Moses and Elijah now. We've already said that, God says. Hear him. This is my son. That locks it up. Does that make sense? That locks it up for the disciples.
And it's established by two witnesses, right? That was another.
You're right. Actually, three witnesses. Because we have the Father, Elijah, and Moses declaring the truth of who Jesus is, which has now already been acknowledged by the disciples just a little bit below where they were in the northern portion of what we think of as Israel or the Golan Heights.
Well, you need two or more, so there they were, two or more. Amen.
Isn't that interesting when you start thinking through where you are, what's going on, and all these things? I think these things are in the minds of the writer of Scripture. They're writing it down. That's why I'm trying to get you hermeneutically. Some of you haven't had PhD in advanced hermeneutics from me. Okay, right? This is the kind of stuff you need to work through to understand Scripture.
Is it fair to say that this might be the first time that the demons openly are going to know who he is? I mean, before I guess, was it before they always called him the son of David? Or is he going to be more recognized now after this event as he moves towards Jerusalem to die?
Well, I don't think we find that the people of Israel in general understood who he was. All the way to the cross, it doesn't seem that they understood who he was. Now, they did like he was a miracle worker. They did like, certain things about him. But I don't think they'd put the messianic idea behind. Now, there's a reason for that relates to Son of David. Okay? Here's where we're going with it. Son of David is an extremely important term. That relates to Matthew and the genealogy. What is it? He is the son of David. It relates to the fact of this statement, their claim, we know you're the Messiah. That's who the son of David was. So they know who he is. And matter of fact, even Satan in the temptation acknowledges who he is. Read the Greek. When he says, if you are the son of God, is not the third class conditional if in the sense. It's actually, since you are the son of God,
yeah,
the Father's going to act this way. He knows who he is. He's not these guys in Jerusalem. Satan knew who he was dealing with. He just was thinking he could get the upper hand, because he's got sin in his heart to the nth degree. He can actually be deceived by himself to think he can do what he can't do because of his pride. People with pride, even demons with pride, don't realize the limitations of their ability because they have such high view of themselves. Does that make sense? I mean, that's what we got with Satan. He's thinking he's going to make some progress here, and of course he makes none. But since you are the son of David, see, that's important in the discussion. Messiah is important, but the people in general didn't understand that ever at that point. Jesus was helping the disciples to understand it, and finally they understood it by the resurrection. Isn't that interesting? It's only in the resurrection, ultimately, that they begin to understand the fact of who Jesus was. Well, anyway, I've taken some time to do some stuff with you because I think it's important that we grasp how to approach the text from different angles and pull out of it what is there to understand. I hope that's helpful. But I want to tackle some more because we got more to talk about in the class. But we do have another 2 hours and 15 minutes minus 10 minutes for a restroom break. But let's move on here then in our look at the, I hope I can do this here. Okay, I've got to get this back over the other side. I think that'll do it. Oh, yes, there we go. So, Christianity rests upon the affirmation that a series of events happen at specific locations. That's really important. Otherwise, it's historically wrong. If the Bible starts being historically wrong, then we got problems. There's something going on in the so-called evangelical world now. And I say so-called because some who call themselves evangelicals, I'm calling now neo-evangelicals, and I'm putting together a book on this. The fact is, dealing with the idea of rejecting the historicity of the biblical text and finding this inerrant truth in the mythologies of the text. The history doesn't really occur. These factual issues don't really matter. The key is the essence of the meaning that we get from it that is really important. That's what's inerrant. The scripture can be all wrong historically in every way, and it's okay. The important thing is that we get the understanding of the lesson that's taught. That's what's inerrant, the lesson. Are you familiar with this idea? This is coming on to us now, and we're going to be dealing with that issue down the way. Now, events at specific locations. See, if history is not important, then locations are irrelevant. For the same ring, externals to the truth that can come through myth is all that's important. Geography, history, faith are inextricably bound together. So when I talk about inerrancy, I mean that whatever the Bible teaches in its history, its geography, and everything. Now, do I allow figures of speech? Sure. I've noticed that some of these people on the air sometimes who are doing the weather obviously have never gone to school and don't have any scientific understanding of the world. Because they even talk about the sun's going to rise tomorrow at such and such a time and it's going to go down at such and such a time. They don't even know that the sun's not moving, the earth is. See, we all understand there's metaphorical language that teaches literal truth. But there's also true historical information that is not merely metaphor or not merely mythical. It is true history, it's true geography. And if we don't grab that, I think we find ourselves in trouble. Geography heightens the impact on our senses and emotions of the reality of these places. And that's why I gave the example of what? I've gone into Arbel. I've gone into the Sea of Galilee, which I can't get away from because this term is so ingrained in our language and our translations that it's hard to get away from it. Jews don't call it the Sea of Galilee because they know better. It's Lake Kinneret. And in some translations, you should know, it took on the Greek form of Gennesaret. But it's the same place, okay? Geography provides a rich and decorative illumination for Bible reading and so forth. So it's important that we learn these things. Enhance awareness of the nuances, helps you to better translate what the text says. I think I've illustrated that to you enough. Is that right? You think you understand what I'm talking about? Now, physical geography. What is from the Greek word earth description. Carl Laney, a guy I went to school with, says a science that describes the surface of the earth and its associated phenomena, including its climates, its peoples, its animals, its products, the geographical view of the world. So understanding these things will help you understand the Bible. Now, obviously, certain things in the Bible are not as important as other things in the Bible. But if it's an error, it's very important. So, I mean, how much do you care about climate that occurred 2,000 years ago? Doesn't affect you unless you believe climate change or something. I don't know. But the fact is, it becomes important possibly in the biblical account, just like even topography is important and so forth. By the way, you can stop me anytime you want to on this stuff if you have questions. So you have a rich and decorative backdrop that heightens a sensory and emotional impact, and I've tried to give that to you by our discussion. Geography, history, and religion are inextricably bound together. You have to have the whole biblical context to be understood. I believe in context, and context, and all its variations in the biblical context. Okay? Christianity rests upon the affirmation that a series of events actually happen. If they didn't happen, the text is wrong. If the text is wrong, it's difficult to deal with the issue of it being from God, because that means that God is wrong. Or God is deceitful, knew better, but thought he would lie to us to deceive us. And then you got a problem with the whole concept of God. These things are bound together. So, you have the table of nations the Bible talks about, and we have many nations in the ancient world, and you have them listed here. And I'm not going to get into prophecy and some of those kind of questions here, because that's far outside the discussion of what we're dealing with. But some of these kinds of places are talked about in the Bible that may even have future significance. So it wouldn't hurt to have an idea about where they are, There's a tribal city list that I've given you here. Oh, that's not going to work. How do I got to get this higher. That's what I got to do. Oh, there. Can you see that? This actually exists. Here's a drawing of it. It's not mine, and I have no idea whose it is, but nonetheless, we have a drawing of the Table of Nations, a listing of these places where they are, the rivers, and so forth. So even from early time. Now, admittedly, this is not a modern map. It's not to the technical nature we would do. I mean, we have elaborate, kinds of things. Even the work of Eusebius, his onomasticon is really better than this. This is a very, very early kind of thing. But nonetheless, it reveals the importance people begin to take in understanding where things are. Another example, the Table of Nations, you have even to the point of explaining specific places. So you have in these then identification of things the biblical text talks about. You understand? You have an early map that mentions places that we find in the biblical text that actually existed. So people at the time understood they existed and had an idea about their actual location. It's not to our specificity, but it is in this time. Anybody know about Shishak, what his name in Egyptian was? Shoshank, Egyptian. Everybody knows Egyptian. Don't you guys study Egyptian at Calvary? I'm joking.
No. That's a hard no.
I don't know Egyptian at all. I did buy an Egyptian book to learn it when I was in Egypt, but I haven't had time to get around to it, and I've had it for about 10 years, so I guess I'll never do it. But this is actually on the city wall at a place called Amun-Re. This is the Amun-Re Temple in Luxor, Egypt. And on this wall, this man in the biblical text, which is called Shishak, is a record of the conquering of this Pharaoh in what we think of as the land of Israel. That's what this is. In the study Bible, if you go to Matthew 1, I actually show you a very close-up of this, because one of the little name rings, sometimes called cartouches, actually possesses the highlands of David, mentions David the king, which is a proof at this period, one of the 3 or 4 that we have, that David actually existed. And it's on this name ring here. Name rings were 2 cartouches that came together. And what happens, see all the, if you look at the picture, you see the guy standing up there, and you see a number of places that are devoid of having these name rings. In the 60s, I believe it was, the Nile rose up very high, and a lot of these name rings here and in other places, other kinds of hieroglyphics, were washed away. Fortunately for us, long before this occurred with the Nile in our modern times, people had already started drawing pictures of these things and photographs of these things, and so we know what was there. But I had my son-in-law, who's a graphic artist, to draw the name rings in very clear. So if you go to the archaeology regarding David, you can see that. If you go to the study Bible. But I have it there for you. It lists 180 places in the Negev. Where's the Negev, by the way?
The South
Desert
Israel?
and southern.
It's the southernmost portion of what we think of as Israel, the Negev. That's where you have Elah, where David fought Goliath. That's where you had Lachish, one of the major cities. That's where you had Arad, one of the major cities, and also Elzaka, which is up in the mountains a little bit, where there's a Philistine site. There's a lot of things. That's a Negev area. Okay, that's the Negev. And then Judah is north of there, and Judah comes from the tribe of Judah. And you had Judah and Benjamin, but in the New Testament it was called Judea. But it was Judah in the Old Testament, named after one of the sons. And so what you have is the Benjamin was such a little small tribe that it sort of came into the timing or in the time it came sort of part of Judah. It didn't have much significance. And the northern kingdom, that would have had the other tribes, right? You had the 2 tribes in the south, the 10 tribes in the north, right? Everybody agree to that? Okay. He claims to have destroyed all these. All right. So you have in the table of nations, you've got tribal lists, you've got a visual map, all sorts of maps and cartouches, and all these pieces of information. All of these help provide understanding of the biblical text, and also the verification of the accuracy of the biblical text. These are really quite important to argue that point. See, a lot of people still, even as historians and people that are biblical scholars who are on the liberal side, they still really believe that the Bible was largely constructed after the time of what we think it was a time of the United Kingdom. And it began to take place in finally the 6th and 5th centuries BC. I mean, Moses didn't do it, and all these other people that we think about had nothing to do with it. It was really something that came about by putting pieces together at a much later period based on the documentary hypothesis, JEDP, and other examples. I mean, this is where a lot of people's heads are. But when you come and you compare the history and geography and all those things the biblical text talks about, then you say, this is information that seems more immediate and more connected to the text at an earlier period for what's the likelihood, apart from our modern educative process, what would be the likelihood of people having that kind of intimate knowledge with what we now know is historically accurate? It's not as though you had libraries like we have. You know what I'm saying? So it gives evidence that there was actually things that were known at the time. See, does that all make sense to you? That's the value of this apologetically. Well, a list of defeated cities of Assyria, that's always a fun one for me. I love it because you have you have Sennacherib coming in. And what he did in his war, he took his army and went down to the lower areas of the Negev, worked his way up, and he took Lachish, which is the second largest, and finally he worked himself up to Jerusalem. Why did he do that? All you military giants, talk to me about it. You're strategist. Okay. The reason why you would take out these other places because you don't want anybody to flank you. If you go up to Jerusalem here with your army and then you haven't conquered these other pieces below, they come together in a group and work you from the back, the others work you from the front. That's how you win wars on the ground. Okay? That's the whole concept of war. So they got rid of all the opposition, little bits, but little groups, and did away with them. So by the time they got to Jerusalem, they'd taken over the whole country but Jerusalem, and they said, "Now you're next." And then remember the people at the top of the story of Hezekiah and so forth. The guys would actually get down there and speak, not in Assyrian, but in Hebrew, to frighten the people. And the people on the top said, "Stop talking in Hebrew, talk in Assyrian," And no, they need to know we're going to wipe them out just like we did everybody else, to scare the people. That's what Hezekiah prayed. God answered prayer. Sennacherib with his gigantic army is sleeping one night. And in the middle of the night, God sends how many angels? One. Every time I read this passage and I think about Jesus in the garden, do you not know that I could ask you the Father and he could send me 20,000 angels or 20 legions of angels? If one angel can take out Sennacherib's 200,000, you don't need a lot more than that. So it's just amusing to me. It's almost like it's some kind of statement, that. But here, Sennacherib woke up in the morning and his army was all dead. Wouldn't that discourage you fighting a battle? He gets up and he says, "Get the chariot. We're heading home." There's humor in the Bible. I mean, I think that's humorous that a guy has such pride and God in one night wipes out all of his dreams of taking over Jerusalem, because finally a man of God prayed, got his heart right, and God came in and defended him and brought victory. Isn't that great? That's a great statement. Not my statement. It's just a great concept. And we know that was actually written in the temple of Sennacherib back in Assyria before his sons killed him. Okay. By the way, you guys, you have lots of preaching material here if you preach. East and West orientation. So let's talk about it. How do we think in America about things? We think north, south, east, west, right? That's how we do it. This seems to be different because their focus is on certain things different. What comes from the east, what comes from the west. You find that you have the difference in the Mediterranean Sea and the land. The structure is a little different than our thinking about it. Well, anybody ever had a copy of Eusebius's Onomasticon? Have you seen that? Yeah, it gives you an understanding of 4th century. What was Eusebius's job at Caesarea by the sea? Anybody know? I'm going to let you go for a break in a few minutes. What was Eusebius doing in Caesarea by the sea? Just visiting or what? So on a field trip? I mean, what was going on with him? Anybody know the name Eusebius? Raise your hand. You know the name Eusebius? Church history? Okay. Eusebius was a 4th century bishop of the church who was the librarian at the library in Caesarea Maritima, where Pilate had been and Herod had been before him. Paul the Apostle was kept there. Caesarea by the sea is Caesarea Maritima. It's distinguished from Caesarea Philippi.
Caesarea Philippi, right? Yeah.
Caesarea Philippi.
Yeah.
Some people just say Caesarea, and that doesn't provide the information you need. Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea Philippi are different altogether on how they're functioning in the land. Okay, both are named after Caesar. I suppose you needed to do that to maintain yourself in good favor with Rome. Okay. Eusebius lived there, and he was a person that had a lot of influence on what was going on in the 4th century. He's not altogether a good guy in some of his thoughts, from our perspective theologically. Can anybody tell me a major flaw in Eusebius's ideas that affect us, at least at Calvary University, and people like me?
Well, he was amillennial, and
He's not a pre-meal kind of guy.
yeah, he was very vocal about Chilius or Chilius. We didn't do exegesis.
He tried to do away with the statements of Irenaeus. He wanted to do with the statements of Papias, called Papias sort of dumb. You know, I didn't know much, sort of a dumb guy. You know, he just had ideas that were not necessarily in view of our understanding. But on other areas, he's okay. But what we find is by the 4th century, our eschatological perspective began to change because of allegory. Because of allegory, that's what we're dealing with. What we have in the early centuries of the Christian era, a big influence of a neoclassical Renaissance at Alexandria, which became the new Athens, and they adopted allegorical interpretation. And thus you have Origen, who eventually influenced Eusebius, influenced Jerome, influenced Augustine, and so we have this whole movement that eventually worked its way into Reformed theology. Prior to that time, matter of fact, Jerome says something interesting. He speaks negatively about the Jews when he deals with the fact of viewpoints that are literal interpretation. He said they interpret the scripture like Jews. That's a negative. Actually, that's a badge of honor because the Jews actually interpreted it like the 1st century Christians, literally. So Paul and the apostles and the Jews in the 1st century and early 2nd century, even into the 3rd, were literalists in their understanding. That's why in Alexandria you had this influx of ideas on allegory because of the Greeks. And I wrote a whole paper on this. You ever want to read it? But I gave it at the pre-trib meeting once. That you have this thing going on in Alexandria, but up in Syria, you have an Antiochian school, which is a literal interpretation, who interpret the scripture like the Jews, which Jerome derided. Eusebius is one of the guys that pushed the allegorical understanding of scripture. That's significant historically, because the Roman church picked that up, the Greek church picked that up, and finally reformers picked it up. Now notice where they picked it up, because reformers went to literal interpretation on every area of theology but, I can't hear you.
Eschatology.
Eschatology. For some reason, it came up okay in everything but eschatology. And that's where they held to the allegorical interpretation. All right. Well, anyway, continuing on, Bishop of Caesarea, so forth and so on. But the Onomasticon is really quite good if you take a look at it. Anybody ever been to Madaba in Jordan? Madaba is a church in Jordan, in the city of Madaba, where on the floor of the church, oh, by the way, there are pictures of this in discussion in the House Visual Study Bible. But on the floor of the church is a map, the best map we have of the ancient world. That's pretty cool. Anyway, I'm going to let you guys take a break. We're going to take about 10 minutes here. I noticed that my wife brought food. So you guys take your 10 minutes or so, and we'll start up again. We'll just keep this running, and we'll go finish with the geography. We'll move into the Old Testament before long. I thought this approach might be of value to you in understanding how you go about and why you go about the task of history, geography, and all these matters. And all these issues are important for understanding the text. Take a break. Oh, hi. Hey, you hear me teaching?
No, I was listening. It was very interesting. Talking about Sennacherib and the angel of death and how we had to just go home after that.
You might want to listen to the whole thing because I talked about the whole importance of
Dr. House, your mic is not muted, just an FYI.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I've got to do?
Just want to let you know because it sounded like you were having a conversation. I don't want you to.
Like my class, they don't know anything. Okay, I'll go.
I didn't say that, but I was just letting you know.
Is everybody back? The recording continues. All right. I mentioned about Eusebius here that we have some things done by, reference to the topography and the distances and the locations. That's a geography. We don't have the original in Greek because Eusebius was, Greek, and Jerome was Latin, and who was there translating the Latin Vulgate. So let me get this over here. There were travelogues done by other people. I'm not going to take time to go into these. These are individuals over time who tried to give us more and more information geographically. The Talmud provides information. Here's the map right here. Look at the wording, Madaba. This is in Jordan. It's up the road from Petra a ways, close to Amman, Jordan, not too far. Here's what it looks like. If you'll notice, and can you see me move my little cursor? Okay, good. Notice what you have here. This is the actual city of Jerusalem. Like if you were to go today, this would be what they're talking about. Now, this obviously doesn't equate with modern Jerusalem in every way. But see these right here? There are these little columns on lining this road, which is the major road through Jerusalem, or major street, maybe it's the right word. These are columns on either side. And at the very end of this column was a statue to the Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian took over Israel with a massive army. In the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, there were 2 Roman legions that conquered the city. Hadrian had 10 Roman legions. It was a massive taking over everything in the country. And that's why he changed the name of the Jewish sites and places, the cities' names and so forth. He did that to embarrass them and to basically demolish them. He made Jerusalem a non-Jewish city. It ceased to be Yerushalayim, became known as Alia Capitolina, the capital of the family of Alia, which is what his family name was. And then he took the Jewish understanding of what we would think of as what you saw, we think of as Philistia and Philistines, which had come from the Greek, and made it the Latin statements of, in Latin, Palestina and Philistia, and Palestina and Palestinians is what I meant to say. So all this discussion of Palestine and Palestinians today reflects all the way back to 135 in the Christian era, AD 135. When I did the study Bible with Earl Rodmacher and Ron Allen, called the Nelson Study Bible, I requested that we consider, and it was adopted, that we would be historically accurate as to what we named the country and the locations of Israel. So it makes sense to say after AD 135, it makes sense to say Philistia and Philistines, because that's what Hadrian called it. And the Jews were forbidden to be in the city. It ceased to be a Jewish city. But up to that point, it was Israel and Yerushalayim and other names that we have in the area. So and since 48, it's back to Israel. By the way, it's not Israel, it's Israel. El, the name of God at the end. But there are people in their archaeology books, I know, follow the word Palestine and Palestinian and so forth. I prefer to follow the fact of what it is now. It is fact Israel, and it's Jerusalem, or Yerushalayim, how you want to say it there to transliterate it. This is the Metabal map. There's different ways to spell this, by the way, because of the vowels. But if you look at it, you'll see what I said before. And then you have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre here. You have these various locations around the city, and it's through this map that came about. I believe it was, I can't remember the exact date in the 500s, the 6th century AD, where they located various biblical sites, and that has helped them. Up here at the top, you can't see it very well, but this is the River Jordan going through here. Okay, that goes into what was called the Sea of Salt in the Old Testament, or the Dead Sea since then. So this is the Madaba map. More detail. What is missing if what I've said so far? What is off the map?
The temple?
Yeah.
The temple and the Temple Mount. Yeah. The temple area should have been right over here. Now, I don't know if that was deliberate or what, but over the years it's worn out or it was taken out. But anyway, that would have been the temple area, but that became meaningless, as far as Christian world was concerned at the time. All right. The Holy City was right there. This area. Okay, now let's move on. The historical geography, we have cities that are different places. Helps us understand. I'm not going to go into too much depth because I really want to move into the history. I'm sure Dr. Gramacki wanted me to do that. But what we've done, we can pretty well figure out where places are. Some places are not as easy as others. There are 3 locations for Cana of Galilee. Which one is correct? I don't know. There were 2 places viewed as maybe where Bethsaida was, but archaeologists have pretty well come to consensus for the current location. A lot of places have been settled for years. We're not debating too much not at all, actually, where Megiddo is or where Carmel is or where Caesarea. Most of these sites that are very well known are pretty well decided, but some are still in question. All right. I'm just going to show you some basic areas here, and I'm going to move on to history as soon as we get through this stuff. But the cradle of civilization, this is always interesting. Of all places for God to put his people was in the way of everybody. I mean, he could have put them in an obscure place somewhere, just find a place any way you want, down here somewhere, and nobody would pay much attention to it. But he puts them right between Egypt and Assyria and the Hittites, and later on the Babylonians and the Persians. They're in the way of everybody because hardly anybody wanted to march their army through the desert. That's not a real smart move if you want to keep much of your army. So he put them through this area right. I can't find my little there. He put them through this area called the Fertile Crescent. A little bitty strip of land, and everywhere they went, 2 things are possible. If they were in God's favor, Israel was in their way to bless the people that came through. If they were in God's disfavor, they were in the way to receive his punishment for being unfaithful. They got stuck in the middle. Which one do they tend to have the most experience with? Okay. You know the story in Deuteronomy 30:31, right? About I will bless you and I will curse you, so forth. That's the thing I criticize in Galatians 1 when people kept translating, particularly the nearly inspired version, sometimes called the NIV, but in which they said, if these people did what they were doing, they would be eternally condemned. And that came from transliterating a word instead of translating it. It's actually talking about the blessings and the cursings that Israel knew in their experience. If you violate this, then you'll receive the cursing of God. Now, that doesn't mean eternal damnation, but that certainly means being under God's out under his judgment, which brought all sorts of problems, over against his blessings. But they finally have corrected it, fortunately. Fertile Crescent, there's a good example of what we're talking about, sort of how it looks from God's perspective here, looking down on the planet. Again, notice the green. That's so important where the green is, and you know why. Mesopotamian area. I'm not going to go into all this right now. Persian Gulf. What is Persian Gulf today called? Anybody know? Okay. Well, anyway. Yeah, the Tigris and Euphrates River. Yeah, the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Okay. And you notice but guess what? Both of those pieces of water tend to do what? Get connected to the Pacific Ocean eventually. You have to have the big thing that fills into the landmass. Fertile Crescent. It's called Levant, Canaan, Israel, Palestine, so-called, beyond the river, Promised Land, all sorts of lands, all sorts of names that are used. Again, I already talked about it being a land bridge. I'm not going to continue with that. But see, God put the Israelites in the right place to do what he wanted to accomplish. It's no accident that Abram was brought by God from the Ur of the Chaldees to Haran and down this way to the land. Because Abraham was the recipient of the covenant, that through him all the nations would be blessed, and also that the Jewish people from him physically would experience several promises fulfilled. The Fertile Crescent geographically has a lot to do with that. Can you see how that's so? He used the geography to accomplish his purposes. So I'm not going to keep moving that. By the way, there is a view that he said, I've set you, Jerusalem, in the center of the nations with countries all around. If you go into the Davidson Center, right near the southwestern portion of the Temple Mount, where the excavation has gone down all the way to the first century level, if you go in the Davidson Center, they have a big thing. Jerusalem is at the center of the earth. What nation, really think about this, all these nations in this globe, which nation's at the center? Well, I'm sure people have different perspectives, but God sees Israel and the Jerusalem as being the center. And so that's an interesting concept. And there you have it. I'm going to move past that. God didn't choose Israel because that they were great. He chose them because he wanted to, which is a sovereign issue. There's another look that you can see. This up here again, just to be sure you understand, that's Persian Gulf. This is the right here. This becomes the this is from, you have to sort of go down here. Let's see, maybe I'm wrong on that. This is the Red Sea. No, this isn't the Persian. This is the Red Sea right here, because this goes around the country of Sinai Desert and so forth. Okay, so I was wrong about that. Okay, there's so much more to talk about, but I'm just going to move on. I don't think there's much more that I want to say. There's more that I could say, but I'm not going to, because I want to move to history. Any questions at this point? The professor really loves it when he's been so perspicuous and clear that there are absolutely no misunderstandings or any questions. I'm glad you did that. Okay, so we'll move off of this, and we're going to move instead to something else. 3. And that is called right here. Uh-oh. I did that one wrong. Apparently, I have to do something that I hadn't thought about. I'm going to end the show. I'm going to go back here and choose. Apparently, I have to choose each one of these. Set up the show. Do it manually. It's going to be by individual win, and that's it. Now, when I do this, if I'm right, yes, I am right. Archaeology and the Old Testament. 3A, that's 4. Let me do this one real quick. Set this one up. Set up show manually. My individual winner. Do this. Start here. Start. Okay, now I got it. Okay, so what we're talking about first of all is this first one on archaeology in the Old Testament, covering some areas, and then I'll tackle the rest. I'm surprised there's no questions for anything I'm saying. Maybe it's just so clear. But anyway, if you have something, let me know. You have archaeology dealing in the Old Testament with some periods of time. And you can understand that the pre-patriarchal time relates to what? This is a question. Now you can participate. The pre-patriarchal time relates to what?
Genesis 1,
the
2.
patriarchs.
The beginning of the Bible, Genesis, all the way up to chapter,
The end of 11, something like that.
basically through 11. It actually starts a little bit earlier than chapter 12, you know, but essentially up to most of chapter 11, and then it starts. So the patriarchal period starts in the very end of 11 and starting with 12 with Abram himself. I want you to notice something. Did you know Abraham? Well, he was called Abram at the time. Did you know Abram had a son by the name of Haran? Let's see if you catch me on that. What's my error, biblical scholars? PhD people. Who was Abram's son? Isaac.
Isaac and Ishmael.
Well, yes, Isaac and Ishmael. So whose son was Terah, who had sons. And the reason why he has Abram to move up to Haran is because it's named probably after the son. They didn't have city signs outside of all these locations. And they begin to receive names from relationships of the people. So Haran became a name of the place after the time of Abram and after the death of Haran. That's what's occurred. So now you have chapter 12. What happens in chapter 12 with the first patriarch?
God began supernaturally working through one man.
Correct. He creates a covenant with one person. Now, there are people, and I'm not even know if they're wrong even, but there are people that believe the first covenant was between God and Adam.
Adam.
An Adamic covenant. But it's never stated to be such. It's never stated in the text to ever be that. So that's a debatable question. What's the real first covenant that's stated to be a covenant?
Abrahamic.
No.
Oh, Noahic. I'm sorry, Noahic.
Yep.
And was
Genesis 9.
Was it a bilateral or unilateral covenant? Was it a conditional or a unconditional covenant?
That's a good question. I never thought about that. I'm going to shoot from the hip and say it was unilateral because God just stated what he was going to do and
Right.
what was going to become of it, but not what the human response was going to be.
That's exactly correct. He never comes down and say, Noah, I'll make a covenant with you. if I do this, will you do this? And you can either receive it or reject what I've got to say. You don't find that in the discussion of the Noahic covenant. He tells Noah.
What's interesting, though, is God uses the same language. This is Chris. God uses the same language with Noah as he did with Abraham or with Adam.
What
So
did he
there's
say?
part of an argument for an Adamic covenant because the same language is used.
Okay, make the argument for me.
Well, I'm not. I mean, as far as be fruitful and multiply, which is an indication of it's a command.
Okay, you have a command involved. He says you're to do this.
Right.
What does he
In the
say?
Adamic covenant, if you will, it says, do this and live, do this and die.
Okay.
Which is also similar to later language of the Mosaic covenant.
Okay. But it's never stated to be a covenant for sure.
No, it's not. It's implicit. It would be an implicit, not an explicit covenant.
Okay. So
which we have all kinds of doctrines that we make those types of arguments for.
Yeah. Well, that's possible. You do in law have covenants that are actually not stated out, but the fact that a person follows it makes them bound by the agreement. It's called an agreement. They don't use the word covenant. Right. But people make sometimes agreements just by implicitly abiding by the policy of the statement. It says that you must have agreed with it or you wouldn't have followed through. Okay, that's a good argument. I appreciate that. Anything else? Well, the Noahic is the first explicit covenant. It seems to be, as Eduardo says, it's a unilateral, not bilateral. He says, God says, I'm going to do this. He didn't have an agreement with Noah for doing anything in reference to the covenant being fulfilled. That's what you have with Abram. It's a unconditional. It doesn't depend upon Abram's faithfulness. You don't find that anywhere there. The actor is God to bring it about. And it's called a unconditional. See, no conditions, and Abram just receives God's statements. You're going to do it. It's going to be this way. This is what I'm going to do. It's unilateral, unconditional. Okay, that's important. Later in covenantal theology, you develop several covenants. Anybody know the covenants in covenant theology, the primary ones?
Grace, works, grace, and then in eternity past, a potential covenant of redemption.
Redemption,
but
yes.
They don't all agree on that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Chris.
Yeah. First of all, covenant of redemption that occurs. What was the statement? And you raised your hand, Christopher.
I was just acknowledging Eduardo's cutting me off. I was just waving him off. No big deal.
Okay, I just didn't want to interrupt you there. Okay, well, in eternity past, God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit got together and had a conversation, and they decided that they would create a covenant called a covenant of redemption, covenant theology. And then you have the covenant of works, in which if you will do this, then this will happen to you. A condition, which is apparently not a unilateral covenant, but a bilateral covenant. If you do this, then I will do this. And then you have the last one, which is a covenant of grace. That is, because man did not follow the covenant of works, then God offers a covenant of grace, unworthiness on man's part to receive God's salvation. That's essentially covenant theology. That's not really received very much in many of the covenant scholars that I read. They basically drop the covenant of redemption, which, by the way, one of the older scholars of that area, Johannes Kochius, never accepted that view. And then you have the covenant of works. They've largely dropped that one. And now the only real covenant theology that's held is mainly the covenant of grace. And it comes into the belief of the Jeremiah passage regarding about the covenant of God with his people and salvation. That's where basically covenant theology is today with the covenant of grace. Dispensationalists have inductive covenants and not theological covenants. What would I mean by that, do you think?
I think it's probably I'm going to just say it's better to know that you're working from what's actually stated in the text, where you have explicit covenants mentioned, and work through those and what those mean and how God is working out the process in human history through His covenants, than inducted or implied covenants or theological covenants. So I feel more comfortable being where the text states it than where a theologian does.
Yeah, inductive refers to explicit statements in the text that actually give rise to the conclusion. A theological covenant is essentially a construction that has been formed outside of specific passages and then put upon the text. And, you know, different ways to look at the issue. I've got a book I've almost finished now called Biblical Covenantalism. I've decided not to use the word dispensationalism at all in the statement. But the book, when it comes out, will be called Biblical Covenantalism, because the thing that I'm concerned with about dispensationalists, that they believe in covenants that are stated and developed in the text. In other words, from the Abrahamic covenant comes the covenant in regards to the physical seed that will be continued. Also, the kingdom that will be established. And then lastly, the blessing from the Jewish people that benefits the entire world. Through the Jewish people comes the benefit to the world. A three-pronged covenant that finds different expressions, but it's all inductively looked at. That's how you come to the conclusions through induction, not deduction. Do you understand what I'm saying by that? So I would prefer not to say dispensationalist, because I think the dispensations that people develop are somewhat constructed that they don't necessarily say exactly that. But I think the covenantalism idea is influenced by a hermeneutic that is literal, grammatical, historical. Anybody want to come back with me on that before I move on?
Well, I would just say I think the idea it's clear that God relates to His people through covenants and explicit covenants. He makes an explicit covenant with Noah, makes an explicit covenant with Abraham. He makes an explicit covenant with Moses. He makes an explicit covenant with David. So the idea of covenant theology, I mean, regardless of how you feel about it, it's very clear that God makes covenants with His people. And so that in itself, the terminology, the name for it, isn't really derived from any, I don't think, theological ground. It's biblical. It's biblical because it's in the text.
Mm-hmm. Well, the covenants, the agreement that is made, if we use that term, is initiated by God. It is explicitly dictated by God. I mean, Abraham and Noah and Moses and none of these guys came up with all the conditions. Every single one is initiated by God and dictated by God. And then there is the requirement that the individual receiving the covenant, that's this unilateral one, follows through, or they receive the repercussions of violating the covenant. I mean,
right. So you could say there's two types of covenants. There's
right.
Conditional and unconditional.
That's correct. That's correct. The Mosaic covenant is a
conditional.
The Abrahamic covenant is an unconditional. Right? The Noahic covenant is an unconditional. So some covenants, you're right. So you've got that, Christopher. Some are conditional, some are unconditional, some are unilateral, some are bilateral. And so we have these things, and it's important, if we understand the text, to know what we're reading.
Amen.
See. So the Mosaic covenant, when did it come to an end of the law?
Well, I guess we could say when they were exiled.
No, they still were under the covenant then.
At the death of Christ.
Christ. The Mosaic covenant essentially stopped at the cross. The covenant with Jeremiah, that is a movement of the unconditional covenant and the heart, and the fact of salvation connected to it, is one that continues on. I think that can be argued, and successfully so. The fact is that that's why a lot of people, I don't know if anybody here follows this, and if I offend you, I'm sorry. It's not my intent. But I don't think the Shabbat, the Sabbath, is a requirement anymore. And one of the reasons it's the seal, the Bible says this, it's the seal or the sign of the covenant. What covenant? The Mosaic covenant. And if the covenant ceases, the sign or seal is no longer significant. The Shabbat actually was viewed as a seal of the covenant in the Mosaic covenant. There's a reason for that. Study the Hittite covenants upon which the Mosaic covenant is patterned. And they always had a seal of the covenant that if the covenant is violated, the seal is broken. So there's a very great comparison between the Mosaic covenant. Remember, who was in association with Egypt for all these years as friends? Against the Assyrians and Babylonians, who was the friends of the Egyptians? The Hittites. The Hittites and the Egyptians had many treaties, and the Hittites, remember I said before that they were a constitutional monarchy, somewhat similar to Britain, at that period of time where everybody else was a dictatorship. And they created legal forms that became used in documents in that time period of the world, including Egypt. Where did Moses receive his training?
Egypt.
Egypt.
In the palace.
Learned in Egypt as a prince of Egypt? The Hittite treaty form. What does and I can show this to you piece by piece, the outline of it. The Hittite treaty form, as it is developed by the Hittites, is followed almost to the letter by the Mosaic covenant. He used the form that it was in existence. And one of the pieces of the form is a seal of the covenant. And that, when the covenant was broken, the seal was broken, no longer in force was the covenant. What is in force is another covenant that came out of Abraham, which brings grace and salvation to the nations. Isn't that a beautiful concept? You know, you can't be saved by the law, but you are saved through God's work in the heart by his covenant with Abraham, through which all the nations will be blessed. That will preach, folks. That's a great statement to develop. I hope you understand that. At least to me it is. That, you know, these things just don't happen in a corner. These things develop over time in the movement of God working with people of God. So, anyway. Archaeology in the monarchy, Saul through Solomon. Well, let's run back here. And then we have the kings and the prophets after Solomon. Moving on. I think moving on. For some reason, it's not moving on.
I have a question.
There it is.
If it doesn't slow us down too much.
Well, go ahead, Christopher.
So would we consider the Davidic covenant to be unconditional? And if so, is there any correlation between God removing people from the actual line? I forget the king's name that was removed out of the genealogy.
It's called Jehoiakim.
Right. Was that a punishment to an unconditional covenant, or?
No, it is an unconditional covenant because it comes out of the Mosaic covenant, part 2 of the Mosaic. I said that wrong. It was an unconditional covenant coming out of the Abrahamic covenant in part 2 of the Abrahamic covenant. Through him, ultimately Messiah came. Now, Jehoiakim you'll never believe this, but the House Visual Study Bible on chapter 1 of Matthew has a very careful description of what was going on in reference to Jehoiakim, Joseph, and Mary, the whole bag, and what's going on. I discussed that whole question there and the genealogy. Jehoiakim was canceled. He said, nobody will ever sit on your. He was also, by the way, called Coniah. That was his. It's like Richard and Dick, you know, those, you know how we abbreviate. Coniah and Jeconiah is the same guy. He was said that nobody will ever sit on your throne, ever. He canceled him out. Joseph was in the line of Jehoiakim. He was legally an heir to the throne, but not in reality. Because God just made a thing. You think this is going to happen, Messiah is not coming through Jehoiakim. And he didn't come through Jehoiakim. He ultimately came through Nathan, through Mary. And so you have a scenario going on there that was anticipated hundreds of years before Mary and Joseph ever lived. God works long time in advance. So you can read on that and see how it works. But the point of it is, David's covenant is going through the Abrahamic covenant. And is given, you know why? Because the Messiah had to be a descendant of
David.
Abraham, ultimately.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so it had to come from Abraham and down, right? His seed that came through Isaac and Jacob and on down and down. See, Ishmael was part of the seed of David. Read Paul's teaching in Romans 9 on this one, if you want to read some more, because he develops the whole concept of Ishmael and Isaac. Through Isaac will your seed be called, not through Ishmael. Okay, so this works down through David all the way down through Ruth and Boaz to Obed to Jesse to David and to ultimately Christ. God works in advance. He's got it all planned out. Well, anyway, did I deal with the question well enough? I don't know. I sometimes get carried away.
Well, I was just wondering, like, you know, you can't violate an unconditional covenant, to my understanding, but yet he was removed from being in the line, but we shouldn't. Maybe that was a separate deal that has nothing to do with the Davidic covenant.
Yeah, the unconditional covenant is not dependent upon the person who receives the covenant. It depends upon the one who gives the covenant. In other words, the one who gives a covenant, it makes it, there are no conditions under which the covenant cannot be enacted. Whatever you want to bring up, the covenant will take place because he will work around everything he needs to do to fulfill what the purpose of the covenant is.
So would it be fair to assume that God made a covenant with Eve when he promised that the seed would come through her before Abraham? Before he gave the covenant to Abraham, he gave it to Eve.
Well, but they're different. They're different in their nature and what they're doing. But, you know, if we argue that that's a covenant, and maybe it is, I'm not saying it's necessarily not, but it's not stated clearly as this is. This is clear. The Adamic covenant is not as clear. So, but maybe it is. I'm not particularly against that.
I just made a new one, the Evanic covenant.
Hey, you can't do that till you graduate with your PhD.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. I'll put that in my notes for later.
Then you can write a book.
And invent words. You can invent words.
Yeah, and get cast out of the church, right?
Well, what I want to know is Eve a man or a woman? I don't know. I'm working on those things. So
What is a woman?
Let's continue on. But good idea, Christopher.
I don't know. I think that was just a social construct that was imposed upon that person named Eve.
You know what I've been identifying myself as? I'm identifying myself as an extremely wealthy man who has millions of dollars in the bank, and all I have to do is convince the bankers to accept my identity.
Yeah, they don't view it as unilateral.
Continue on. What you're looking at here on the computer screen is, you may not know the site, but this particular site we're looking at, we're looking for a picture that was taken in the mountain called Azekah. Okay, Azekah in the text. Looking down on this site, which is the big one in front of you, is where the Israelites once stood in the time of Saul and David. That's where soldiers of Israel were. 2 brothers of David were there. You notice they're not on the battlefield, they're up on the mountain. Okay? David, whereas you can't see it, but follow my little thing here. See that? Here it is. David was over here, behind that mountain, right over this way, in a place called Bethlehem. He took some food to his brothers coming down the mountains when he comes, and he comes here to this particular hill to see Saul and his brothers and so forth. This area here was full of Philistines. And if you follow my little thing, it goes around here and goes way up into the mountains in this area here, okay? That's where the Philistines were. So this is the laying out of the armies. The Philistines were pretty powerful. They were Greeks, Greek islands, who came to Israel. It's not unusual, by the way. I don't know if you know this, but Hannibal, you read about Hannibal, right? Hannibal, who was in the north of Israel, came through the through Mediterranean Sea over to northern Africa to a place called Carthage and conquered, and then eventually went to Spain and conquered, and didn't quite get down to the gates of Rome. But that's Hannibal and the elephants. These are all things that happen in history. But you had a Semitic person, Hannibal, conquer a northern African group and a Roman and Greek group kind of thing. That's what you have going on. The ancient world had all these movements. Well, the Philistines came to Israel on the corner, on the island, and they stayed next to the Aegean Sea. Then you have, but you know what? They were on flat ground. They had an advantage to the Israelites. They had iron as a weapon, not copper or bronze. They also had chariots. But they couldn't do well with their chariots in mountain terrain. They really did well only if they had flat land, like you find to the area of the shores of the Aegean, the Mediterranean Sea, all the way up toward Jerusalem, which was all in the hills. So they didn't have an advantage up there. So the terrain, geography, has something to say about what goes on in world history. You with me? Sort of laid out the thing. The Philistines, the giant came out and would yell and scream and said, you know, who can come and so forth. And then the Israelites are on the mountain. They're not down there talking to the giant because they got the advantage from coming up to try to fight a war. So they had this contest. You get down there, you sort of get a perspective. Right down here, there is a stream where David would have gotten the rocks. I've got pictures from the other side, but this gives you a basic feel for the valley of Elah, E-L-A-H, and the area called the Negev. Okay? Geography and history together. There's a picture of the mountainside right over here I talked about a moment ago. This is where the stream is, and this is where the plain was, where David and Goliath had their battle. This is a stream. Notice it's not full of water. It's not the time of the year to have water in there, but it does get in there. Okay? I prefer not to go to this part of the world when it's raining a lot. I go to when it's nice. I tell people you can pick up a piece of stone because the Israelis keep filling it with stone every week. I'm joking. But you don't pick up a flat piece like you would throw across a pond. you pick up a nice round piece that works well in a slingshot. Otherwise, when it's going toward Goliath's head, it goes like that. Okay, you with me? Well, history behind Lachish. Now, distinguish between Lachish, notice that Hebrew sound, Lachish versus Laish. Laish is up in the north of where Tel Dan is, and Lachish is the second major city in Israel for most of its history here after Jerusalem. Okay? I've got a great story with this, but I don't know if you want to take time to hear it because it's a miracle. So, what happened to me is that I was trying to film for, guess what? Making videos for the House Visual Study Bible. And I can't help it. It just keeps coming up in the conversation. But it was raining in Israel at the time. We got up to Arad and went up the road to the gates. And as we arrived at it, and the rain stopped. So let's get all of our stuff out, and we'll run up there, and we'll get up there and get our pictures. And before the rain starts again, we get up there, we take our pictures, get everything done we want to do, get back to the van, we get in the van, and the rain started. Next site, Valley of Elah. No, excuse me. That's Arad. Yeah, Valley of Elah. We drive down the road, get to the Valley of Elah, and it was raining. We stopped, and the rain stopped. We got out and did all of our video, got back into the van, and the rain started. We drove to Beersheba, raining water. We got to Beersheba, said, I wonder if we can do our pictures here. The rain stopped. We got out and did all our pictures at Beersheba, got back in, and the rain started up again. I'm not joking with you. And we drove to Lachish, and we took a picture I think I have here. And it was beautiful. The rain stopped. And there was the sun was beating down on the stone, and it was just like lights on the top of Lachish. And I thought, this is a sign. I kid you not, this actually happened. And I don't usually expect things like this. I'm not charismatic enough. But it actually happened, and I don't know how to explain it to this day. Isn't that weird? Anyway, Lachish, second largest city. They have some wonderful archaeological stuff up here. But we're going to look at the city now. When the sun came down, this picture was taken that day, that all of a sudden the sun came out, was beautiful on the mountain, and this happened, the rain stopped. And that's what it looked like. Every time I think about that, I think, I just don't understand that. I don't expect God to do something like that for me. I just get where I get my pictures, my videos. Anyway, there it is. This is Lachish, eventually taken by Sennacherib, but it's this right here, by the way, is the gates into the city, right there. You've got a pathway here that would be good for people walking, and also chariots to go up if you had them. Okay. Up in this area, as you go up, you begin to have buildings on the other side of this this little mound right here of various sorts. That's looking from the other angle. You can see some of the buildings I talked about. Where you just saw a moment ago is down here, with this right here going down the side of the mountain there. Okay, this is top of Lachish. Now, the Lachish relief is found in the Israel Museum, but not the original. The original, okay? This is a replica inside the Israel Museum. The people who ran away with it are called British. They took everybody's stuff. When they conquered the world at the time, the British Empire, they went in and found all sorts of neat things they wanted to take back to England. So here you have where it occurred in Israel. They get a replica of what's in the British Museum. But at least in the replica, you can see the features. You look at this picture, guess who are in fact the Assyrians versus those who are not.
Syrians have the funny helmets there.
Those are
pointed ones.
They have funny helmets that have little peaks to them. Guess who these young people are and all these people walking here and carry things around? They're Israelites taken into captivity. By the way, the Assyrians were really mean, nasty people. The nearest thing to them may be the Nazis. But the Assyrians were very evil. They treated people with despicable activity. I mean, the things they would put people on spears and poles and hang them up. They would cut off arms and legs and they did all sorts of very mean, nasty things to people. There were no laws that said, you had to treat people humanely. People in the world hated the Assyrians. Thus comes along a guy by the name of Jonah. He did not want to go and give any grace from God to these people called Assyrians. So having background information puts perspective to the stories. Jonah said, oh yes, I'll go tell the Assyrians if they'll repent, God won't destroy them. So that's why he headed the opposite direction, because he knew God could be gracious. And he thought they don't deserve a inkling of God's unmerited favor. Interesting, the word. He wants them to be destroyed with everything in his body. That's why when he goes in there, he doesn't go in there and do like we would do in preaching a gospel. He would, I'm sure, run through the city, Assyria will be destroyed in 3 days. Just sort of mumble it out and walk on through and head out. He went up on there, and they had the fruit and all the kind of stuff in the shade. And you know the story, don't you? But you've got to read that in light of these people. He says, God, kill every one of them, because they don't deserve any mercy. Forgetting that that's what God often does, is bestow unmerited favor to people who deserve damnation. Isn't that amazing? The biblical text is an amazing text. It's almost as if it were written by a divine force.
Sounding like a Jehovah's Witness with that last statement there.
No, I mean, we're surprised and say, because you have people today, they deserve. I was thinking about this COVID thing. I mentioned to a person today, I said, you know what? Certain people, and I mentioned names, maybe I shouldn't say them on the telecast here, but certain people connected to all that ought to be put up against a wall and shot. And I thought, no, maybe just life imprisonment. Because the failure to tell the truth and the devastation that they caused to hundreds of thousands of people for the purpose of getting money. They were willing to sacrifice anybody to get ahead. And I won't go into all that, but I've spent a lot of time reading and studying this. And I'm absolutely convinced, I call it the plandemic, for the purpose of furthering certain people's, the old thing years ago, they said, follow the money. Usually it's follow the money or follow the pride, one of the two, people trying to get their own way, no matter who gets hurt. People operate that way. Anyway, I'll stop the politics and the stuff now. But that's the point, is, how do you deal with the fact that you want people to be punished for their evil? Jonah said, Go for it. You know, in 3 days you'll be destroyed. I'll just sit here and watch you. And then God taught him a lesson. Okay? But that's depicted here. I think you can see some of that if you look at the figures that are there, the difference between the soldiers and the people that are taken into captivity. Place of trumpeting. This was on the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount, way up high. It fell down during the devastation. There were all sorts of rocks besides this. The Romans, when they came, they knocked off a lot of the rock around the Temple Mount. But they didn't destroy all the Temple Mount. Some people, Jesus said not one stone will be left on another. Is the Bible wrong? Because we got a lot of stone left. Aha! Reading the Bible more carefully and contextually. The disciples and Jesus walked across probably the bridge that went across the Kedron up to what we think of as the Mount of Olives. And the disciples were talking with each other about the buildings on the Temple Mount and how beautiful they were. Well, you do have them. I'm not going to say what I could say. I keep on wanting to say it because it's sort of funny because I cover all this stuff. But you have the Solomon's portico. You have the beautiful temple. You have other buildings on top of the Temple Mount that Herod the Great built. He built a flat surface on a mountaintop that had to be filled in and let up, that had to be adjusted to be a flat surface. And there were all these beautiful buildings, and the disciples are talking about the buildings on the Temple Mount. And then Jesus' response to this statement about their discussion of the temple buildings, he said, not one stone will be left upon another that you guys are talking about. And you know what? Not a single stone of those buildings are on the Temple Mount and haven't been, including the temple itself. So he wasn't discussing the wall. See, some people come back and say, aha, Jesus' statements are not true. Yes, they are. Matter of fact, they're very true contextually. He didn't say you had to knock off the entire Temple Mount that Herod had built that you're standing on. All these buildings are going to be gone, and every one was gone. And they knocked off some of the walls around that fell, but not all of them. And so this was one of the ones that was preserved, right from the corner that speaks about to the place of trumpeting. So what does that relate to? This is the place one of the priests would stand there with a shofar, and he would blow the beginning and the ending of Shabbat. He would blow the beginning and ending of the festivals, the feasts. That's where this all occurred, and that's what that deals with. That's a fascinating thing to be found relating to Jewish history. Archaeology is fun, by the way. Here's a Babylonian story of the flood. Now, you have variations between the Babylonian story and the biblical story. You also have the story of what is called Gilgamesh, okay, which is another flood story. And then you have creation stories too, Enuma Elish and such like. There are stories in the Assyro-Babylonian, largely those areas. There are some other countries that have bits and pieces, but those are the two major forces for so long. You don't really have that much in the Egyptian literature, but Assyro-Babylonian tends to have a lot of this stuff written in cuneiform, you know what all that is, and talking about the flood. Why did God destroy people in the flood in the Assyro-Babylonian mythologies? I don't know. Let me say that another way. Why did the gods destroy the people in the flood according to the Assyro-Babylonian artifacts here, the accounts?
Because they were noisy.
Yeah, what else? Anything? It wasn't because they were sinful or anything?
I don't remember. I just remember being noisy. I don't remember the.
It's
I think their stereo's too loud.
it's somewhat trite, isn't it? Somewhat trite. The biblical account, why did God destroy the world? Every
Because of
thought of
wickedness.
the heart was, every thought, think on that. Every thought of their heart was evil. They were sinners to the core. They were doing terrible, detestable, ungodly things, contrary to his purposes in the creation of humanity. So what you find in the biblical account is moral issues, questions of natural theology even, whereas in the other accounts, it's somewhat trite. Why did God create the human race to begin with in the Babylonian and Assyrian accounts?
Have them do their work for them.
I talked about this at the beginning of our talk today. Yeah.
That might be the Sumerian version, to have them. They created mankind in order to be their slaves and do their work.
Yeah, basically that was the view in the ancient Near East. You're talking about Sumer, Samaritan, but you also find that developed elsewhere. They created humans to work for them and feed them and take care of them, and they weren't doing a good job of it, so get rid of them. That's basically what you end up with. That is not the reason why God created humans in the Hebrew account. He created humans in his own image. He created humans to be people who actually had very significant and worthwhile functions as people that would multiply and fill the earth and tend to the ground and would be people who were productive. Quite a different way of looking at humanity for the reason of creation or destruction. It seems that the biblical account seems to have a lot of more dignified and significant and honorable kinds of viewpoints for creation, and also very devastating reasons why humankind should be destroyed. You see such a difference. You have scholars argue, however, that the biblical account simply copied the pagan accounts. But they're so far beyond that, they only have a commonality. I don't think they borrow. I think they both come from a common source and humanity that works its way up, so that the biblical account represents the authentic account from the period, and the others become deviations from that. At least that's what I would hold to be true. Here's a Gilgamesh epic. It has some similarities, but I get back. There's similarities, but it's not really of the higher nature of the biblical account. Here's one, another archaeological find. This is, by the way, fairly recent. I can't remember the exact date. 2005 I got here, I think. Couldn't remember the date. I knew it was recent. This is, in fact, found in the city of Gath. Why is that significant?
It's where Goliath was born.
That's where Goliath, that was his home, right?
Right, right.
So since it says Goliath here, so this must be the Goliath of the Bible. You can't argue that, because it doesn't say this is Goliath of the Bible, let me sign my name. What it does demonstrate, though, is this, that the name Goliath is a legitimate name from the city in which the Goliath came in the Bible, and he may be related to Goliath, he may be Goliath, whatever it may be. The point of it is, it clarifies the fact that it's a name that would be used, and that gives an added focus for what we see with the biblical account. You can't prove more than that, unless maybe you could come up. if you looked at them long enough, maybe you could come up and find something else that would, maybe support it being maybe the real Goliath. But I don't know. But at least it demonstrates the name is around. I've gone into this before. I'm going to move on from that. What about the flood? Here's the Hadrahassus epic, the Babylonian Genesis. You have several different ones, Assyrio, Babylonia, and as Christopher said earlier, you have sometimes Sumerian, some of these kind of things. We have a lot of this information. I think I'll pass on. The last thing, I've mentioned there are three different ways to look at it. They were Israelites' accounts that were borrowed by the Mesopotamian religion. They were Mesopotamian borrowed by the Israelites. Or I think the third is the most likely. They have a common source. The common source, as came through Moses, I think was guided by, of all things, the Spirit of God. I think I read that in Peter somewhere. Where is it? Men of God were moved, something like that. I think that's what we encounter here. We also have, by the way, the family histories called the Toledot, which are important, that seems to be something that is preserved through these various groupings that are united and related to one another that come up to the time of Moses also. Boy, that looks like one of my charts. Oh. Anyway, this shows the relationships between the two. You can read them. I can't take time to develop all these for you. You can read them if you desire. This is being taped. If you want to look at it later, you can always turn here and look at the examples. But you find some aspects that are similar, other aspects that are very not similar. Notice how many days the flood lasted with the Genesis over against the Gilgamesh. 40 days and 40 nights is quite a bit of rain coming full blast. 6 days and 6 nights just get you wet. So there seems to be a difference here. Physical records, things are, again, things you can look through. I don't want to spend that much time. You find commonalities and dissimilarities. This is something to do with the Old Testament. We have the inscription here. Oh, this is not what I thought it was. How did that get here? Anyway, this is the James Ossuary, which is another issue. That's a New Testament one. Maybe I've got into the New Testament period. I actually saw this. I went to the museum in Toronto, Ontario, during a meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature up there, I think. And they had the James Ossuary. I wrote an article on the James Ossuary for a book that had a compendium of archaeological articles. And it's not found in situ. You know what that means? All you archaeology buffs?
Does that mean where it lays? Where it lays?
Yeah, the location of where it was found. In other words, found
Right.
in where it was uncovered, it's found in that location, which gives it more credibility.
Yeah.
This was found by having been in a someone's shop that was selling it. But you had several world famous scholars in the area of inscriptions and ancient writing, both who affirmed that these were legitimate. So actually, they were never. It went to court because of issues, but the actual writing itself, by people that were world famous in inscriptions, said these are legitimate. They were not made by someone else contemporaneous in the contemporary times. I think it probably was legitimate. You can read the article if you ever want to on that. Matt, I even have it. I don't know if you look. Remember, I gave a bunch of articles for you guys to read. I think in some of your handouts and such. I think I have an article on this, and if you don't have it, just let me know and I'll let you read it. Here's another example where it talks about James' brother, Joseph, let's see, what does it say? I can't even remember anymore. Yeshua. Oh yeah, Jesus, brother of James, and I can't even remember. I'm sorry, I'm making a lot of nonsense here. I can't remember exactly the angle. I don't know, for some reason I can't think of it, but it's there. You can look at it. Oh, here, look here, James. Well, you know what? I put it here. Son of. That's son of. I couldn't figure out. Son of Joseph and brother of James. Okay, there it is. Of Jesus, I mean. I think I'm getting tired. I've been talking for 3 hours. Boy, James, the son of Joseph, and brother of Jesus. But all of these actually are found to be legitimate inscriptions. So you can decide whether you think it's legit or not. Some scholars have argued it is. The Caiaphas, this is found in the Israel Museum. Isn't that beautiful as an ossuary? The first and second temple period are different as to how people are buried. This is a result of Second Temple Judaism that we find in the first century of the Christian era. The other way people were buried were quite different. They would take a person, wrap them up, put them on a level, a year later come back for the second burial, which is common in Jewish law, and all the body is basically decayed and you have bones left over. You take it and you put it underneath where the person lay in like a vault with an opening. And in there is all the fathers. You're gathered to your fathers. When the Bible talks about that, that's what it's discussing. That's the first temple, early 8th century, for example, burials ideas. Then you have the first and the second temple. This is the second temple, first century. If you'll notice above, they were put in ossuaries. Instead of lying on top and being thrown underneath altogether, they were actually separately put into bone boxes and put into a little encasement. So you can clearly tell the difference between the two. This is a reference that's important. This goes back to the idea of the synagogue. So let me get back here. There I am. No, this isn't that. I'm reading it again. This is the fact. I have one like that too. I have one that's a statement of the synagogue called the Theodosian inscription. But as I'm looking at this is not it. This is the one on the Polytarch. I picked this off, I think, of this reference to Thessalonica. This is the one I picked at Miletus, yeah. This was Thessalonica, which is up in the area of Macedonia, and where you have Philippi, Thessalonica, and so forth. Thessalonica is right on the coast, and it used to be argued by scholars that Luke was not a good historian. This is New Testament. I've already moved past the Old Testament, so I think I'll hold off on these. This is one I found at Miletus in the theater. So I'll go back into this later when I get to the New Testament. That's one of my favorite pictures. This camel is drinking this, its diet at least, its diet, folks, a diet Pepsi at Petra. Isn't that a great picture? He really liked this. The guy the next year when I was there, he told me it bit him. And I said, why? He said, well, I fed him some beer. So apparently he preferred Diet Pepsi to beer because he bit the guy. He showed me where he was bitten. Okay, I think I've gone through that. I'm going to stop here. How we doing? We got a few minutes left. Let me start you in the next one. Wait just a second on that. And this is number 3. Where's 4? Here's number 4. At first, Dr. Gramacki said maybe I should just simply go through all my New Testament stuff or just play his video that he did and forget about it. But I really want to be with you. And I thought I need to take, and I tend to work in New Testament archaeology more than Old Testament archaeology. And I thought, well, I'll do the Old Testament I have, but I got a lot more New Testament stuff. And when the time comes, I'll show you some really, really cool stuff, because that's my area. The book I'm writing on archaeology right now is on the New Testament archaeology. But it's all important, but, you know, follow the same methods and so forth. But let me show you this while we're at it. This is some of the same stuff. I'm not sure whether I have some things that are different or not. I think I did. I just pulled this together today when I was wanting to, I think it's the same disc. I thought I had some differences. Oh, here's what I had difference. Yeah, I did have some differences on this right here. I just didn't put them in the same file. Okay, let me show this to you. This is cool as far as Old Testament stuff goes. This is a good example. Look at how good this is. This was well done. This obviously has been embellished by some graphic artists today, but this is a better look at the map than I had on the other side. Remember that when I showed you? This is a better look at the map. If you look at it, you can see Mesopotamia. You're familiar with that? Akkad and Sumer, of the Chaldees, they call it, Sumer. Up here, they come up here to Mari, Euphrates, all the way up here in a place called Ebla. You're familiar with that probably. Ugarit, which is Canaanite. I had to study Ugaritic. I learned the Ugaritic language as one of my trainings. And then you go on down. Finally, you have Jerusalem, Gaza Strip. You've heard of that. Sinai. People debate on where Sodom and Gomorrah is. Have you heard of the place called Tal Ahamam? Has that come to your ears yet? I've been there, I think, 6 times doing work at the Tal Ahamam, which is across from Jericho, across from the River Jordan, and it's in Jordan. And there's debate on whether that is Sodom and Gomorrah here, or whether it is in fact right here, or whether it's more right about here. Tal Hammam is done by Steve Collins at Tal Hammam, and a lot of other people, for example, W.F. Albright, Randall Price, Bryant Wood, and some others, if you know those names, believe it's right down here where it is. See that? That's where some people believe it is. Other people believe it's right up about here, when it's still the River Jordan before it goes into the Dead Sea. Okay, 2 basic views. I'm not real convinced by the southern, but there's some problems with the northern too, so I'm not sure what to tell you right now. If you want to discuss it, I have all the information. I could talk about it for an hour. But rather than get into all that, I tend to favor the north. And the reason why I tend to favor the north is because right about here, there's a place called Ai and Bethel. You ever heard of those cities? And where Lot and where Lot and Abraham were, is between Ai and Bethel, where they're standing up there talking about dividing the land. And they said, well, this area here, that's too high, that's Syria. But this land here, in between these places, is a well-watered area. And in this well-watered area, there was a city called Sodom. And then you had cities around Sodom. Well, when you look at the mountainscape of where they were in this area, at Ai and Bethel, Jericho's around here, you'd have to be able to have X-ray vision to see through the mountains down to the south. You'd also have to have telescopic vision. It's about 20 miles or 25 miles down. So I have trouble with this being it. Where's the thing? I have trouble with this being it because I don't think they could overcome those difficulties. Plus, this is in fact all watered by underground streams today, and probably was in the days of Abraham. So you had a place that had the water, had the cities, and it was visible by Ai and Bethel. So to me, that lends support to Sodom being, in fact, Tahamah. Plus, we found, I think, 5 different cities around this place. There are reasons why some people feel it's in the south too, but, that's an issue. All right, now, continuing. I want to move past that. This is a movement from Ur. Here's this place called Haran. Some people say Haran or something, but anyway, Haran. Crossing the Euphrates and so forth. This is Ur, where Abraham was. He came up to here. Then he moved down to these areas, went down to Egypt, and came back. Where did Abram actually was he buried? Where was that?
The cave at Machpelah.
Hebron.
Hebron. Yes, Hebron. And you can go there today and find the cave in which he was buried. It was a cave, but in a place called Hebron. Abram, his wife, Isaac, Jacob, on down. Rachel was buried another place. Anybody know?
Bethlehem.
Yeah, Bethlehem. But all the rest of the kinfolk were basically not Joseph, as far as we know. He was a separate, but were basically buried in a place called Hebron. This is a movement of Abraham. This is, this sort of looks like the Temple Mount, but it was built by Herod, the same as the Temple Mount. That's the reason it threw me off for a second. This is, in fact, the burial area of all the patriarchs, except for Joseph. And I don't think Joseph was here and the others. But it was built by Herod, so it has the same design as the Temple Mount. That's what threw me off for a second. Anything else to tell you? How many been to Israel? Eduardo has, and who else? Okay, David has. This is Tel Megiddo. Look at this with me a second. This is how the cities were built. Now, this is not how they were built. This was done by an archaeologist or a group where they're digging in to get a look at the city. But if you look here a second, this would have to be where here you see right here. I may have a better shot, but this right here is a Canaanite altar. I hope I have a better shot. Somewhere else you could find a better shot that I could tell you, but I'll not mention. But we have actually, this is a ramp that the chariots would come up. This right here is stairs that would go up to the same location, a little different than Lachish. But Megiddo and what you find at Chazor or Chatzor or Hazor, people say it sometimes, and Gezer are very, very close to this because they were built by the same architect of Solomon. About 20-something civilizations from its initiation to the time of Solomon. But you'll see they've cut into it quite a bit. But this right here, this is where a horse thing was. They kept the horses because it became a chariot city under Solomon. They had horses and chariots. You have the Canaanite stuff that I've told you about. There is a three divided area of gates that come into the city, and they were able, because of this one, to find them also at Chatzor and Gezer. This is a House of David inscription. I've held this in my hands, folks. I spent the day with Avraham Biren at Hebrew Union College, who found it, and I got pictures of me, and you'll see in a moment, I think. But this actually says, you can see in the Hebrew, no, it's Aramaic. I thought somebody can correct me. This is done in Aramaic and proves that the Jews didn't do it. It was done by another country, talking about David's house. The house of David, speaking of David the king as having really existed. That's a little closer look at it. It's like Dalet, Vav, Dalet. There's a translation of it. Okay. There's Avraham Biren showing it to you. And there's a young, eager to be archaeologist. spending time there. This is that Highlands of David thing I told you about. And I had my son-in-law to use his graphic arts and create the equivalent that would have been here based on what we know it said. See, we have pictures of this before it was destroyed, so we can know exactly what it should be. But somebody had to put them in, and that's what he's done. I think he did a pretty good job, actually. That's the place called Laish, not Lachish. They call this Abe's Gate sometimes, as Abraham may have come through it in this city. It's built on a slope with these rocks to keep people getting in by you trying to knock the door down with some kind of a tree or something. That's another look. It's a model. Tell Jericho. How many people lived in Jericho, do you think?
Several hundred.
Yeah, just a couple hundred or so. How many people lived in Taha Mam? About 10,000. A little bit bigger city. And that would have been Sodom. Very, very influential, and people went to. Lot went over there because it seemed to have all the benefits, sort of like, San Francisco. And he got there and he became a part of the city council, because sitting in the gates is a way of speaking about being on the city council. That's where they deliberated. And you see that at Tel Dan. But that's Jericho. There's several things to be said about this, but we won't go into them right now. Guess who are the Hebrews here?
The bearded ones.
Huh?
The bearded ones.
Yeah, the Egyptians did not like hair, and so they did not wear beards, but the Semitic people did. Very good. Well, I think I've gone through Hattusha with you before. I've showed you stuff about the Hittites. Oh, I maybe need to show this to you. This gives you a feel for where they were. The Hittite kingdom, which existed, between about the 18th century and the 12th, went out of existence. We don't really know exactly why. But the Assyrians were over here, the Babylonians here, the Persians over here, the Egyptians are here, and here's Israel. And the Hittites had deals with Egypt, but did not like the area. They did not like the Assyrians or the Babylonians. But look how big their kingdom is in modern day Turkey. Pretty good size. And I really wish I knew the reason for their demise. I don't really understand that. But anyway, that's them. That's the entrance. I've already showed this to you, I think. Isn't that beautiful? I was there in the wintertime. Well, I tell you what, I think I'm going to let that go with what we're going to do. Let me ask if there are any more questions. We got 4 minutes left. There's so much that could be covered, but I'm just not going to do it all. Next week, Dr. Gramacki will be back, and he can take off and maybe do some more here if he wants. There are many other things to discuss, but I gave you an introduction to it. And then when I get to the New Testament, I've got some really cool stuff to show you. All of it found in the Visual Study Bible, you realize.
Thank you.
You guys are great. You really are. I appreciate each of you participating eagerly, and it helps a lot to have that. And I love to see smiling faces instead of pieces of discussion questions. I've had people come up to me, "You were my professor," and I said, "Really? Who are you? I've never seen you in my life." Really, it just doesn't feel the same, So I'm glad Calvary is actually doing this instead of the other way. You guys are getting, in my opinion, a far, far, far better education. Plus, they're pretty tough on you in Greek and Hebrew too, right? That's good.
Yes.
All right. Well, anyway, I'll let you go. God bless you. Let's end in prayer. Lord, we just thank you for our time together and your many blessings to us that you've revealed. And we have all of this through Jesus and the sacrifice that he made and what your desires are for us. For whatever purposes, Lord, you know, but we know that we will fulfill your purposes. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Talk to you
Dr.
later.
House.
God bless.
Dr. House. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Good
much.
night, guys.
Appreciate you. I'm going to let you leave, and then I'll turn off the recording here somewhere. Okay, leave.